I don't know what happened with that other video, but continuing, this is part two of the progressives, just in case you're wondering. It'll be two short videos instead of a long one. I hate to repeat myself that close. Okay, so we were talking about progressive movements, social problems that they are fixing, poor conditions, poor work conditions, poor living conditions. Number one, you pass laws, you have inspectors come, you have regulations. The other solution to this was the settlement home movement, which actually started in Britain. And not surprisingly, the Quakers are very prominent in this whole movement. If you look at slides 16 and 17, you have Jane Addams and you have a picture of Hull House. One of the first in America was started in the middle of the slums in Chicago. The building is still there. I've actually visited it. Jane Addams was a very wealthy single woman who we found out long after she died was also gay. Who cares? And she devoted her life to helping the conditions in these poor immigrant slum neighborhoods. And she bought a big house in the middle of rundown area, called it Hull House. And basically, what this is a community center today. We have these all over in cities, in different neighborhoods, and we call them community centers. What happened at Hull House is the same thing that happens at community centers. At free cost, poor immigrants could come, or poor people could come. They could get training in trades, they could take classes, they could learn English. They had the first actual kindergarten in America at Hull House. So the kindergarten preschool program starts there. They got health care screenings. There were playgrounds. There was no place else for children to play. So it provides resources to people who need it, who need everything because they have nothing. So the two solutions were either more regulations and laws or providing community centers, what we would call today community centers. This is still going on. Jane Addams and the community centers, the settlement home movement, they lived there. They were not wealthy people who came in and then left at the end of the day. They accepted the immigrants as equal. They worked with them. Many of the other progressives did not, but the settlement home workers actually did. Today, we still have this. There are investigative journalists, undercover journalists who go in and explore bad working conditions. There is a woman journalist within the last 10 years who's written two books. One is called Stiffed. The other one is called Nickel and Dimed. They are both about working conditions of poor workers, basically. She was, like most of the progressives, a magazine writer, and her editor one day, they were talking about, poor working conditions and underpaid low-level workers. And he said, you know what? Go and find out. I'll pay for you. You spend a year. And she took 4 minimum wage jobs in 4 parts of the country, 4 different cities at 4 different occupations. One of them was working just as a stocker at Walmart. One of them was working in a grocery store. One of them was a waitress in a little restaurant someplace. And the fourth one, she was a cleaning lady who was sent out to clean houses with a crew. So 4 minimum wage jobs. And of course, she had a lifeline. If she got really stuck, which she did once during the year, she could call up her editor at the magazine and say, hey, I'm completely broke. You need to send me some money. I can't pay the rent. And he did. But her conclusion at the end, and she wrote several books about this, was that a minimum wage, a single person working minimum wage, finds it almost impossible to survive in America. We didn't have the documentation. She went out and did it and described in great detail the working conditions of minimum wage workers. Why is she doing this? Who's going to read this book? Probably not the minimum wage workers, the rest of us, the middle class who don't know what it's like to be a clerk at Walmart. Actually, I did this in college, so I actually know that. To be a waitress, to be a cleaning lady. Most of us do not know that. How do we learn it? We read it from somebody who has experienced it. So social problems, there was a lot of progress on that. The other issue is corrupt government. And that's slide 14 and 15. The man here to remember is Lincoln Steffens. And I remember Lincoln because government politics, so Lincoln Steffens. Jane Addams with Hull House, Lincoln Steffens wrote several books. Was government corrupt in the early 1900s? It makes us look completely honest today. It was so bad. Government on all levels. And I'm quoting Lincoln Steffens here. In a country where business is dominant, businessmen will corrupt a government which can pass laws to help business. His job, really, he was more of a muckraker. His job was to expose the problems in government. His goal, get rid of the bad guys. He didn't think the whole system was corrupt when he started. He thought there were bad politicians. Little by little, as he spends years doing this, he finally figures out the whole system is pretty rotten. So how did he do this? He went into a number of cities. He wrote several books. The first is Shame of the Cities. And he went to 5 different cities in the Midwest and on the East Coast. One of them was New York, one of them Chicago, one Philadelphia, I forget the other 2. And he sat in City Hall. He just sat quietly on a bench. People got to know him. He would eat his lunch there. He talked to cleaning ladies. He talked to local politicians. He talked to people coming and going. And nobody had ever done this before. So they told him everything. They told him this is how it works. This is how the bribe system works. These are where the local bosses are. This is the kickback they get for this, that, and the other thing. You want to build a bridge in New York, you better make sure the politician in charge of allocating the money for that bridge gets his percentage off the top. He wrote it all down in notes and went home and published a book. And it was earth-shattering. Again, who's reading this? People that vote, middle and upper class people who vote. They had no idea what was going on at City Hall. I mean, everybody knew there's corruption in New York City, but nobody knew exactly what was going on. He named names. He had the amounts of bribes. He had the paperwork to document it. And the result, the next election cycle, most of those corrupt politicians were voted out in their different cities. So immediate progress based on an undercover journalist, basically. After that, he did the same thing in the Senate and wrote a book called The Treason of the Senate. He is calling U.S. senators treasonous, traitors to America. That's pretty volatile stuff, pretty dangerous stuff. He did the same thing. He sat down in the Senate in a side corridor and talked to janitors and office staff and different senators and anybody who would sit down and talk with him. Obviously, they didn't know who he was. There was no photograph published in the first book, so this was a new thing. Nobody was prepared for it. Nobody had their guard up, and he got all kinds of information. And the same type of bribery going on. You want a law passed to favor your business or a law withdrawn to favor your business, you pay money to the politicians who are in charge of passing the law. And he got the documentation for this. Senators were doing this so systematically, senators themselves had their own published list of bribe prices. So if you want a contract to build a road, well, okay, that's a $50,000 bribe. You want a contract to build a local courthouse, that's a $75,000 bribe. They actually had published the price lists of different items and their bribes that they needed out of it. It was amazing stuff. He published this in his book, Treason of the Senate. He named names. Again, a huge explosion with this. These people are voted out in the next elections. After a while, Lincoln Steffens kind of gave up because he saw there's huge problems and we keep cycling through people and they become corrupt because the system is corrupt. But short term, he made a lot of progress and changed a lot of things. So how do you change corrupt government? First thing you do, one of the solutions was bring in not politicians, but experts, unelected scientists, managers to manage particularly local government. They will study the problems, they will devise solutions. Take the politicians out of the equation. This is the first time since the early 1800s when you begin to get licensing agencies for doctors and lawyers and other people as well. Because up to this point, you wanted to be a doctor or lawyer, you hung a shingle out and that was it, and you could practice. So now we have licensing because there was a lot of abuse of that system. So instead of mayors, which we have a mayor in Austin, we also have a city manager who really runs the city. The mayor votes on the council and they vote on a lot of issues, but the city manager does the nuts and bolts and the day-to-day running of the government. And he is a professional. He is not elected. He's not a political figure. He's a manager. This is scientific management. You also, in 1912, get direct election of senators. This is a huge improvement because up to this point, senators were chosen by their state legislators. So there's a lot of politics going on. Having the public elect their senators removes the politicians from the equation. This, again, is the rise of the social services. We get a Civil Service Act, which is still used. You want a government job, the first thing you do is you have to pass the civil service exam, which is basically an IQ and talent exam. So, for example, if you want a job as a forest ranger, you take the civil service exam, and the forest district is supposed to hire the highest grade on the exam. It doesn't always work like that. There are other factors, but theoretically, they are supposed to hire the most qualified candidate. How did people get jobs before this? Your Uncle Fred knew somebody at City Hall. You had connections. So this is certainly an improvement on just word of mouth hiring. And it happens first in the cities and then nationwide. Another solution to corruption in government was what we call, and they called, gas and water socialism. Cities bought and ran their own utilities. What was done before this? Utilities were private companies. Private companies, by definition, run for profit. And many of them were ripping off the public. Public had no choice. We still have no choice. Who runs your utilities in Austin? City of Austin runs garbage, water, electricity. You don't have a choice. But the goal of the city is not how much profit they can make, but to provide services without losing money. So, sideline here, why are our utilities in Austin so high? Because they raid the utility funds, which everybody has to pay, to support other things which the public will not pay, like libraries and parks. And that's why utilities are high in Austin. I'm on the edge of Austin. We don't use Austin electricity. We use Pedernales Electric Cooperative, which is run by the members, for the members. And if there is a profit at the end of the year, we get a rebate. We get money back on our electric bill because the goal is not a profit, but to provide service at cost. This is a huge improvement. We don't even think about that. Our buses, our transit system, our sewage, everything is run by the city. I'm not saying this is always great, but there is no profit margin involved. They are doing this to provide services at cost. It was better than what was there in the 1890s. Another factor of this is recall initiative referendum, which we have. We don't use it very much in Texas and California. These are used all the time. Okay, so what's the difference between these? A recall election is a politician who is elected and the public votes to recall him before his term is up. You can get this started by petition, but usually we wait for the next election and get the guy out. But if it's a particularly bad case, and this has happened on occasion, you can have a recall election and get the guy out. Initiative is a proposal from the public. So if, for example, I'm not arguing this, I'm using this as an example, if we wanted free use of marijuana in Texas, okay? If we got enough signatures on petitions, they could be sent to the state legislature, and the state legislature, if they had enough petitions, would put an initiative on the ballot, on the next ballot. So the public would actually vote on a measure that they want when the state legislature doesn't necessarily want to deal with it. It could come straight from the public. Referendum is kind of the same thing. The public votes on a law that is already passed by the legislature. So state legislature votes, I don't know, I'm using another real controversial example here, to ban abortions in Texas. I'm not talking about the issue, I'm talking about an example, okay? And the state legislature votes there will be no abortions in Texas. If we got enough petitions, we could have a referendum on that issue at the next election, and the public could vote on this. It's already been passed by the legislature, but the public could vote to repeal that specific law. All of these initiative, recall, referendum give a lot of power to the public. You have to organize, you have to have enough people, enough members, but it gives a lot of power, and it short circuits the legislature in the state or in a city as well. This is also when we begin to get direct primaries for presidential elections. Instead of a nominee for president or for other jobs being chosen by politicians, they are chosen by the voters. And our presidential elections, they're kind of determined already by the polls. But in my lifetime, you used to have conventions and people used to actually vote on these issues. Who is our candidate? Is it, I don't know, Donald Trump or Mitt Romney? And the delegates would vote on this issue. Again, a lot of power to the public instead of politicians. So these are ways to improve things. Moral issues, we'll talk a lot about prohibition later, but moral issues were slide number 21, and then I've got a lot of illustrations there. These were based on ideas, not just efficiency, but that something is morally wrong, that this is an issue that needs to be fixed because it is just wrong. It is not good for people. And one of the first were these very large businesses, these huge trusts. The name here is Ida Tarbell. The connection I always make, tar, she investigated Standard Oil and tar. These companies, many people thought, were destroying capitalism. Monopolies are not capitalism. They are monopolies, and they raise prices for everybody. Again, magazine writers, Ida Tarbell was a reporter for a magazine, and her editor said, we've been talking about this for a while. You go out undercover and you investigate and you find out about these very large monopoly corporations. Her eyes lit up and she said, I know just the one I want to pick. Her father in Pennsylvania had been in the oil business and Rockefeller had destroyed his business. So she said, I'm going to pick the biggest guy on the block. I'm going to pick Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, and Standard Oil. And she spent 2 years undercover. She investigated, talked to all kinds of people, and wrote the history of Standard Oil and exposed his ruthless tactics to destroy competition and undercut competition so he could raise prices and create a monopoly. Direct result of this was finally enforcing something that had been on the books and not enforced, but the Sherman Antitrust Act, which outlawed very large companies. And under Teddy Roosevelt, we began to break up. Standard Oil was broken up under Teddy Roosevelt shortly after this. The last prohibition I will talk about later. Prohibition, the control of alcohol, banning alcohol. Clearly, this is a moral issue. Alcohol is bad for people, bad for the country, but we'll talk about it later. The other one, which I find fascinating, is the Pure Food and Drug Act. There was no regulation on food or drugs. And the guy here is a very famous name every American should know, Upton Sinclair. He is a reporter, and he is intrigued by the fact that during the Spanish-American War, we killed hundreds of our own men with bad meat. He went undercover as an ordinary worker in the slaughterhouses in Chicago. and was appalled by what he found. What he intended to do was to talk about the abuse of immigrants and how they were literally being worked to death in these meatpacking plants. But as one critic said, he aimed at the nation's heart to have sympathy for immigrants. Instead, he hit its stomach because he wrote a novel, very realistic novel, about immigrant life and about what the slaughterhouses did and how people worked in the slaughterhouses. And he was very blunt and very forthright. Nobody reads that book anymore. Everybody in my generation, it was assigned in high school. He talked about the horrors of the slaughterhouses, not for the animals, but for the people, where people were literally ground up into the sausage when they fell into the vats, where people had their fingers and toes disintegrated by the acids used in packing the meat, where there was an actual case of a young 12-year-old worker who accidentally was locked overnight in a storage shed, and the rats ate him and killed him overnight. Upton Sinclair was challenged immediately by the meatpacking conglomerate. The large meatpacker said, "This is all lies." He said, "I have documentation. Here's the newspaper stories. Here's the actual cases." And he could document every incident in the book, all of which actually happened. Teddy Roosevelt was president at the time when the book was published. He said, "Nah, this can't be real." He sent his own men undercover into the meatpacking plant. They came back after 6 months and said, "President Roosevelt, Upton Sinclair is wrong. It is not like he described it. It is much worse than he described it." Teddy Roosevelt immediately began pushing for regulation of food processing and foods. He released part of the report to the newspapers. The meatpackers resisted. He said, "I'll release the rest of it with the rest of the stories." And they fell into line. Upton Sinclair later on, because of his experience, became a socialist and ran for California governor as a socialist. He did not win, but he got an awful lot of votes. This is in the 1930s. The other part of this equation was drugs. So we begin to get some regulation for food, which is why when you go to the store, you know what you're going to buy. Most times will not poison you. Drugs were completely unregulated. And it's another magazine, Ladies' Home Journal, that investigates patent medicines. You could, in your bathtub, mix up any darn thing, put it in bottles, and sell it on the corner. There was zero regulation. This is still an issue today because health supplements are also not regulated. Drugs are, but not health supplements. So, and people have done studies on this. Nobody knows what's in the different ones today. What they found in their undercover investigations, they bought this stuff and then had it tested. Very simple. Is there was a baby tonic, a medicine for babies that had 40% alcohol and opium and codeine in it. Yeah, that kid's going to shut up real quick with that medicine. For pregnant women, a medicine that had 1 part opium, 3 parts alcohol, 1 part digitalis. Digitalis is a drug that is used to regulate heartbeats. It affects the heart rate. This was given to pregnant women. They shut up pretty quickly too, I suspect. This is not ancient history. My father worked for the city of Chicago, and he happened to be a chemist, and his job was testing meat 2 days a week. He was in court testifying against meatpacking companies for putting crap in their meat products. And if you read The Jungle, which I recommend sometime, this is true for me. I have never touched a hot dog since reading The Jungle. I will never eat bologna. I will never eat a hot dog. I don't eat most sausage either. What they find in meat today is sometimes much of the same thing they found in 1900. It has not disappeared. My father made a living testifying about the crap they found in processed meat in meatpacking plants. The solution, of course, government regulation. Pass laws, get professionals, get inspectors. This is also the start of the consumer movement because we as consumers have a lot of power to do this as well. Public petitions went to Congress. Immediately there were new laws passed. So we are relatively safe with our food processing, but not completely. It should bother us all that in the last 10 years, the number of food inspectors has been cut in half from the Food and Drug Administration. So we have half of the regulation we used to. And we all know in the news, we hear regularly, there are outbreaks of salmonella or botulism or other things in different products, mostly meat, because all animals in their intestines carry E. coli. And if it gets into ground meat in the food supply, the entire supply has E. coli in it, and it can kill you. That is why it's always ground beef that's recalled, not pork chops. Pork chops come from a single animal. Ground beef comes from 500 different cows. And if there's one mistake in the processing, the whole batch goes. Anyway, so have a good time. Go out and eat hot dogs for lunch. Take care.